Welcome to Issues That Matter. I'm Cynthia Pooler, and my guest today is Kathy Kelly, and she's a longtime peace activist, and she comes from Chicago, and she's come to Albany a few times. So, Kathy, when you read and heard about the news between the war between um, the Ukraine and Russia, what were your thoughts?
Oh, I felt such dismay and foreboding and sadness and anxiety. And I guess I immediately thought of Ammon Hennessy, a longtime anarchist who helped form and shape early days of something called the Catholic Worker Movement. And he said, you can't be a vegetarian between meals, and you can't be a pacifist between wars. And
Mm-hmm.
Cynthia, something maybe a bit unusual about me is that I hadn't had a television since I was 17. I just
Wow.
went through war after war after war, and some of them I witnessed firsthand by being in the war zone. But I
Mm-hmm.
wasn't accustomed to really watching mainstream news coverage. But I have watched the CNN coverage of this war, and I sense that in several ways there could be kind of a paradigmatic shift. I never use that word, but a big shift
Okay.
going on because the empathy that's being built up through the mainstream media for people who can't escape war or are trying to escape war and are dealing with just explosions and traumas and bereavement and children being orphaned and people plunged into becoming refugees. It's fixating, and I think people are outraged. So if that same coverage could happen for every war,
Mm-hmm.
might we finally get to the point where we'd say, we can't go on like this because it is the truth. And the other thing I think is stunning is the big shift in the way refugees are being welcomed. There's not a single cage for a child at the border between Poland and Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't to say that everyone has been welcomed, because there are Black people and brown people fleeing Ukraine who have not been so welcomed. But on the whole, particularly in Poland, people have just shown, no, we don't want big refugee camps. Come to our homes. Our doors are open. We'll find a way. And so I hope that that can become something for people to behold, because with the climate catastrophe we're all facing, the greatest terror we really face is climate catastrophe. There are going to be many, many, many thousands and millions more refugees trying to find ways to survive. So that idea of sharing resources, maybe living a little more simply, I think that's all well and good. But then I think, oh my gosh, for Yemen, which you can't say to people in Yemen, oh, now you can live more simply. They're on the verge of famine now. Why? Because Saudi Arabia and the UAE have been bombing their infrastructure, bludgeoning them with airstrikes, committing atrocity after atrocity, prolonging a terrible blockade and war. And the world doesn't pay attention to that atrocity. And it's really very similar to what Putin is doing. And Yemen gets 38% of its grain from the combination of grain planted in Ukraine and grain sold by Russia. So there they are. It's not likely Ukraine's going to be planting that crop of wheat. And the United States has an embargo on sales from Russia. And so the prices are skyrocketing in Yemen, where people are already just in a merciless situation. 33,000 people have already died during what is now the 8th year of war in Yemen. And the US continues to supply the Saudis with parts, spare parts, and maintenance for their airplanes, without which the Saudis wouldn't be able to continue the war. So we do have these double standards.
So, when did you first get started in the peace movement?
I was a late bloomer, Cynthia. I did not really do anything more than write papers at Loyola University with regard to the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
I should have been out in the streets, but I couldn't imagine being active. I carefully read like Sojourner magazine and knew what the Berrigans were saying, but I just couldn't imagine picking up the phone even to make a phone call. I didn't write letters to the editor. I wasn't out in the streets. But then I was working on a master's degree in theology and taking a lot of my courses at the Jesuit School of Theology. This was all in Chicago. And I realized, I can talk a good line about how our God hears the cry of the poor, but I really do not very often see people who are poor. I'm living in Hyde Park, and I mean, I didn't have any money, but I was living in one of the wealthiest neighborhoods because that's where my courses were. Um, and so I finally took the advice of a very dear professor. He said, well, why don't you go up to the north side and go to that soup kitchen in that Catholic worker house? And I said, oh, all right. And so I went up to volunteer at a soup kitchen on the north side of Chicago, in the poorest area of the north side of Chicago. And I think I moved up there within 2 or 3 months, and life got awfully easy after that.
Mm-hmm.
I was in with some of the finest people in the world, and they couldn't begin to distinguish care for people's needs from resisting United States war making and nuclear weapon buildup. So probably within about 3 or 4 years, I was pretty steadily involved in nonviolent civil disobedience. And then I became a war tax refuser, and I lowered my salary beneath the taxable income at St. Ignatius College Prep, where I was a teacher. And then I eventually, after that, went to prison for a year for planting corn on nuclear missile silo sites. And it seemed like a logical next step was to join a peace team in a war zone. So in 1991, I went off to Iraq. And I'd say that from that time on, earning an income has always been kind of secondary to being full tilt involved in peace movement efforts.
Mm-hmm. So you've been to a lot of countries, haven't you?
Well, that's true. I have. I have spent a fair amount of time in Iraq, always going there to break the economic sanctions against Iraq by packing our duffel bags filled with like medicines and vitamins for children. But I was there in 1991 during what was called the Desert Fox invasion with a peace team. I was there with a peace team. And then we realized that the economic war was even more brutal and lethal than the bombing war had been. So that's when we tried to object to that by breaking those economic sanctions. And then I went to Iraq again in 2003 with a peace team, and we remained in Baghdad all through the shock and awe bombing.
Wow.
Yeah, and then I was in Gaza during one of the worst of the Israeli bombings in 2009, and then again in 2013 during another very harsh bombing. And then I was in Lebanon during the Israeli Hezbollah war, and in Afghanistan many, many times, about 28 or 30 times since 2010. So I have been in war zones. I was also in Nicaragua when I was very young. And that was one of my first exposures to being with people who were really terrified by what was going to happen to their children during the course of a war. So I'm unhesitatingly against all wars. I believe that war is never the answer. But lately I really liked hearing from Ilhan Omar, the representative who herself was a refugee from war in Somalia. And she's so clear. She says we need foresight. She was opposing the idea of a no-fly zone over Ukraine because she said, that would get us closer possibly to World War III. But she was saying we need courage. And then she said we need humility. And boy, I think that's important, the humility to acknowledge that as outraged as we might be over what Vladimir Putin is doing, we ought to recognize that the United States has acted so similarly again and again and again.
I, what do you think is going to happen as this unfolds?
Well, we can scour the news every day and see, are they getting any closer to negotiating a ceasefire and ending this ghastly killing and bloodletting and wreckage. I think one thing is certain: Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman are going to have more profits. You could see it's so interesting to look at the spreadsheets, and on February 24th, all of a sudden there's an upward trajectory for each of those companies in terms of the worth of their stocks, and then it comes down a bit, but they'll come out ahead and they'll sell a lot more weapons and they'll test a lot of their weapons, and other countries are going to say, oh, give us these weapons. And even Germany is now saying, yeah, maybe we're done with our time of being uninvolved in military conflicts. We better get some more weapons. So NATO gets a new lease on life, which I don't think should have happened. I think the world would be better off if NATO had been disbanded, and if the energies and efforts and problem solving and ingenuity and money being poured into the troves of these cash consumers in NATO for weapons, if that had been disbanded, then people would be finding other ways to solve problems using real diplomacy and carrots and collaborating to solve problems we all face, like the pandemics and climate catastrophe and nuclear proliferation. But I do think there's a chance that people will start to recognize that it's wrong for nuclear weapon wielding states to be able to bully people because we could use this weapon. So I hope there will be a prohibition against using nuclear threats. Vladimir Putin is using the nuclear threat right now, and he is bullying and menacing people, and people are afraid to try and stop him. Like, what if he actually uses it? And the Chinese version of our Predator drone can carry a tactical nuclear weapon. It's a very frightening time. But the United States has threatened to use nuclear weapons in
Mm-mm.
our history. So isn't it time for all of the states in all of the world to say we all can sign the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons? So far, the non-nuclear weapon-bearing states have said, yeah, I'll sign that treaty, but none of the nuclear weapon-bearing states have done so. Realistically, what will happen? I'm very nervous that by the time the fighting subsides, and that could be months, it could be years, Ukraine will be devastated. Russia's economy will be very, very weakened. There will be a new Cold War in a sense. Russia and China might link up more as a united hegemon against the United States. I think there will possibly be far more enmity in our world, and this will be a terrible, terrible shame. And it may be in a way that the NATO states will end up kind of using Ukraine like a battering ram to get enough conflict going so that there can be a continued belief in the desirability of NATO and having these alliances. But I think that's all terribly unfortunate, and I hope that something different could happen. I hope that maybe President Zelensky will say, you know what, we are going to be neutral. We're going to go into dialogue about what will happen in the Donbass, and we are not going to keep seeking more and more weapons because it could just prolong and exacerbate the suffering.
So I'm sure you've talked to a lot of your colleagues as this has been unfolding. What do they say?
Well, for instance, I'm very much in touch with the Ban Killer Drones campaign, bankillerdrones.org. And um, these new generations of drones, some of them are that the Turkish scientists have made and sold to the Ukraine, are so tiny you could fit 100 of them almost in a small container, and these can kind of hover and find personnel more or less, and so the threat of assassination becomes much greater. Already several generals, Russian generals, have been assassinated. And I don't think anybody's entirely sure just how did that happen. But for instance, when President Biden says, basically, Vladimir Putin's got to go, you could imagine a lot of people in Russia would think, well, the combination of that statement plus these drones escalates the risk, because the United States did, not through drones, but they did accomplish regime change in Iraq. Saddam Hussein is gone. It was executed. They accomplished regime change in Libya. Gaddafi is gone, killed. And General Soleimani was a pretty high-ranking Iranian officer, and he was assassinated. So this idea of the United States using assassination when it wants to be rid of somebody, if you're somebody who thinks, I think I just got a threat, a pretty serious threat, people take that seriously. And I think we're going to see a great proliferation of reliance on drone warfare, which is pitiful because it doesn't end conflicts. It makes generals more ready to take risks because they're not putting boots on the ground. They're just flying these drones around. But it can really escalate and prolong conflicts. But General Atomics, which makes those drones, is sure to think, well, hooray, this is terrific. I'm very close to people with World Beyond War. They asked me to become their board president last week, and I said yes. Maybe I was biting off more than I can chew. I don't know, but that group is saying Russia out of Ukraine, NATO out of existence. That's pretty brash, isn't it? But I think we should really consider that. And then I'm close with people in the Peace News in the United Kingdom. It's a very good group of people who've been anti-war and have helped with every peace team I've ever been part of. And they're so bright. I especially draw attention to Milan Rai, who is the editor along with his spouse, Emily Johns. And Peace News is just getting ready to release a statement calling for a worldwide prohibition on using the nuclear threat. And then I'm also so glad to see that in New York City, our friends with the Kings Bay Plowshares, the people who did a plowshares action at the nuclear submarine site in Kings Bay, Georgia, they finished serving long prison sentences, 3 years for Jesuit priest Steve Kelly. And several of them are still on probation, but they're going to do a walk from the Riverside Church on April 4th, the day that marks when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King gave the wonderful, brilliant speech called Beyond Vietnam. And when he challenged the US government as the greatest purveyor of violence in our world. And they're going to walk from there to the Isaiah Wall at the United Nations and really make a plea for putting an end to war and an end to the nuclear threat, which is so omnicidal. So I'm in Chicago. I don't think I'll be able to join them for that walk. I'm just kind of beginning to tiptoe out after these pandemic years, but I sure wish them well. And I hope anybody in New York will avail themselves of the opportunity to walk with them. Just look for Kings Bay Plowshares 7.org on their website, and you can get the details, or people could be in touch with me. I'd be happy to put my email in the chat.
So since the pandemic, you haven't traveled much, have you?
No, I went to Iowa last weekend, and that was or 2 weekends ago, that was one of my first times going anywhere other than the dentist's office in Chicago.
I see.
But
So,
Cynthia, I'm not unhappy about that. I loved going to visit with young friends in Afghanistan. I only know Afghanistan through a keyhole, just one neighborhood. I always went to the exact same neighborhood, almost every trip, stayed in, different apartments that they'd get. because they were always moving, but and their hospitality was so great, and I learned a great deal from them. But I really have to ask myself about the consumption of jet fuel. And now that we have this Zoom technology, what does it make sense to try to foster the connections? It's good to meet face to face, but then keep those connections perhaps going through these other means. But I'm so happy that 8 of our young friends, well, one of them an infant, have resettled into Portugal. And now we can see them starting a new life. And it was all through, WhatsApp and Signal and Zoom and email that an ad hoc group was able to help them make that move.
So I'm sure you've been in contact with people who are over uh, in the war zone area.
Mm.
Um, what what are they telling you? What are they telling the people in Ukraine? What have you heard from them or about them?
Well, one of the board members for World Beyond War is a young man named Yuli Shelyazhenko. And you can also hear him on Democracy Now! And he's been very brave, I think. He has said that he is a conscientious objector to war, and he doesn't want to be recruited for conscription for anybody's army. And he also doesn't think that they should trust any group that's bringing weapons into the situation, because that will prolong the war. And he is seeking for a negotiated settlement, and he's right there. He lives in Kiev. So I'm very impressed by him. I'm also grateful every time I learn of people who are bravely trying to assist people, driving ambulances, welcoming people across borders. I was impressed to know a group of Chicagoans, including a psychiatric nurse who went over to deliver what they could to assist with trauma. So these kinds of actions are all good and needed. I also want to point out that Medea Benjamin is in Afghanistan now.
Mm-hmm.
And she has certainly spoken out, calling for an end to the war in Ukraine. But, she can see that much and all is, people are distressed by what's happening to people in Ukraine. What about the very recent decision of Joe Biden to impose an economic warfare against Afghanistan? I mean, he has frozen Afghanistan's assets in their central bank, $7 billion worth of greatly needed assets. And Afghanistan is undergoing starvation. Their economy is collapsing. 13,000 infants have already died. And, you know, that has to be recognized as well. The Ukraine war is terrible, but it's not the only war going on in the world.
When people turn on the news, that's all they hear is the war, between Ukraine and Russia. Can you enlighten us as to what other conflicts are going on right now?
Well, certainly, I'm very powerfully aware of the war in Yemen. As I mentioned, that's going into its 8th year, and the United States is very complicit with that. And it could be that 2 Congress people, Pramila Jayapal and Congressman Peter Fazio, both Democrats, this week or next week will introduce a bill called the Yemen War Powers Act, saying Congress should take back the authority to declare wars. The president can't unilaterally declare war and then stop supporting the Saudis in that warfare. I am also, so aware that an economic war is being waged against Afghanistan. And I believe that the sanctions against Iran are a form of economic warfare. And sometimes this economic warfare can be more brutal, more lethal, because it destroys infrastructure and it makes it impossible for people to import what they need or sell what they have. So So we have that situation going on with Iran. And then in Africa, there's not a settlement yet between Ethiopia and Tigray. That's still raging. In Somalia, there's warfare still going on. And the United Nations, I believe, needs all the assistance it can get to help give people a hope that if they lay down their weapons, they can rebuild, they can reconstruct. But I think people that are living in lands where the United States has waged wars of choice should be getting reparations. I think about Iraq, and the violence certainly hasn't completely subsided in Iraq, and there are new generations of ISIS coming up, and it's partly because of desperation. People can't feed their families, they can't find jobs, they get desperate, they know how to pick up a gun, they find guns, the guns are always available, it seems, and the bullets, and then the warring starts all over again.
So, people listening to us right now, um, they they watch the TV, they become knowledgeable about what's happening. But for the most part, do you think people feel helpless and really trying to do something? I mean, what can the average person in this country do to stop all the violence around the world?
Well, one of the things I like to say is follow the young people. I mean, that sunrise movement, they are undeterred. They're walking, they're marching, they're uniting, they're organizing. And these are young, idealistic people who say, look, we've got to live on this planet. We have to find the resources not to continue maintaining military might, but to maintain our ability to survive because we start practicing how to store water, how to repair the ground, how to stop relying on fossil fuels, and how to stop taking, the blood of the earth in a sense by constantly removing the fossil fuels. And then there's the Poor People's Campaign is so important for our time. And they always include in their events a repudiation of militarism and warfare. So everybody can get involved in a very grassroots way on efforts to end climate catastrophe and efforts to promote the Poor People's Campaign. And then, I think, we've got a legislative, an executive, and a judicial branch of government. Well, we
Mhm.
have to use that legislative branch. We have to exercise the leverage we have and call our Congress people constantly and tell them again and again, we don't want you to wage war in our name. And then as far as the executive branch, the midterm elections are coming up. President Biden is certainly looking at where the votes are coming from. And are we going to let the Republicans get the upper hand in terms of saying that we have to cut back on efforts for health care, for education, for restoring the infrastructure of our neighborhoods? It's a very important time to be politically involved in those regards as well.
So we're just about out of time, Kathy. Can you give the contact information for your groups so if people want to join or participate, how can they do so?
Well, I've been mentioning World Beyond War. So just Google World Beyond War, and there's a very good website that's full of actions that people can be part of, and it's quite international. They don't have an actual office anywhere in the world because they see every place in the world as part of an equal egalitarian chapter.
Mhm.
So that's very exciting. And then bankillerdrones.org is a way to be involved in seeking a treaty to prohibit weaponized drones and prohibit drone attacks. I think that's important. And then certainly to be involved with the Kings Bay Plowshares, if you're in the New York area with their April 4th walk, just Google Kings Bay Plowshares7.org. And, I think every city and many small towns, if you take a look, you'll find, and many of your listeners already have, some place that's offering food to people that are hungry or shelter to
Mhm.
people that might otherwise be homeless. And I think, find those people and get involved in it. It helps put us on a good path.
And so, Kathy, we're out of time, and I hope that you and I will be able to talk again.
Oh, I would love that, Cynthia.
Oh,
Thank you for
thank
your
you.
interest, and your curiosity is wonderful.
So you've been listening to Kathy Kelly. This is issues. Uh, oh my God, I'm tired.
Oh,
Um, so if you like this show, please
promote it.
subscribe. Please subscribe to my
Exactly.
YouTube channel. Um, so Kathy, thank you. We'll talk again, and thank you everybody for listening. Have a wonderful day.
I'm going to go subscribe now. Thank you.
Thank you.